I'm going to give you 6 tips for starting seeds indoors and getting a head start on the growing season, plus a few money-saving tips along the way. Welcome to Better Terra. I'm Josh, and today I hope to share with you a few tips that I've learned about starting seeds indoors. These are some of the methods that I've developed over the years from lessons learned and a lot of failures. If you like this video and you think this is something you can use this year, please click that like button. And if you have a comment, leave it for us below. Why do we start seeds indoors? And what are the benefits? Do you need a greenhouse or a seed starting shelf like this? Let's explore some of those questions. Let's talk about why we're going to start seeds indoors and what's the benefit. The biggest benefit is being able to get a huge jump start on the growing season. We can start our seeds indoors well before the last frost of the season. For us here in zone 6B, 5A, we can start ours about 2 months before that last frost. Then after that last frost, we can move our plants that are already nicely established out to the garden when the temperatures are ideal. In some cases, if you have a greenhouse, there can be an intermediate step between starting seeds indoors and moving them to the garden. When the outdoor temperatures are reaching a median, you can move your seed starters to a greenhouse. The only thing you really have to worry about then is keeping your greenhouse temperatures at night to an acceptable level. We plan on adding a greenhouse to the Better Terra garden this year, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the episodes where we focus on greenhouses. Another benefit of starting seeds indoors is the lower cost. Starting your plants from seed is far cheaper than going to a nursery and purchasing all your plants as transplants. If you're focusing on an organic operation, starting your seeds indoors gives you that insurance of knowing where your plant has been from seed to harvest. You know all the products that have been added to that plant from the get-go. Now, let's get into the tips for starting your seeds indoors. And hold out to the end. You might be surprised by my final tip. Tip number 1, selecting the right location and lighting to start your seed. I've seen a lot of people that think that starting their seeds in front of a sunny window is what a seedling needs. And direct sunlight is a good thing. But in the early spring, when we're trying to start seeds, there isn't enough sunlight to make strong seedlings. Seedlings require 16 to 20 hours of direct light when they're getting started. If you start your seeds in front of a window, you'll notice that your plants will be really leggy. They'll start to stretch towards the light source. So they're focusing on all of this stem growth instead of healthy root growth. The stems will be really thin and not very strong. So when you can get the light right on top of your plants and they're not reaching for the light, that's the best condition. My tip is to start your seeds in a very controlled lighting situation. I start my seeds here in my basement office. We have a window, but it doesn't get direct sunlight. I'm able to control exactly where my light is. And I'm able to adjust the height of my lights right on top of the seeds. It's bright. This one's I have adjusted a little higher on the top shelf. So as the plant grows, I'm able to raise the light up to be just above the plants. Choosing the right light for your space is just as important as choosing the right location. If you have a nice controlled location and you have a light that you can't get right down on top of your plants, then it's no different than starting in front of the window. They're still going to stretch for that light. I have an example of another kind of grow light here that clips onto a surface and then you can move it where you need it. But if I were to use this, the plants that are back here would start to move towards the light. They would get leggy and move towards that light source. So that's something that we don't want either. These kind of lights work pretty good for clipping on the side of potted plants and giving them extra light when they're in the house over the winter. Tip number 1 is starting your seeds in a location where you can precisely control the light. For my second tip, we're going to talk about containers. Picking the right container is pretty important. If you select the wrong size container for starting your seedling in, you could maybe cause your seedling a little more stress than needed. Let's take tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, for example. These are very common plants to start as seeds before the growing season. If you were to start a tomato, a pepper, or an eggplant in a small cell like this, just after a few weeks, it's going to be outgrowing the space. And then you'd have to transplant it to a larger container to finish out its growing cycle. So the tip is, if you have a big plant, start it in a bigger container. There's no problem with that. So these are the containers that I use for starting things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. And I've actually saved some of the carrying, the holding trays to make it easier for moving in and out of the shelf downstairs, and then when it's time, out to the garden, or this year out to the greenhouse. And now for my first cost-saving tip. These containers are containers that I've kept from buying transplants from the store in the past. I've gotten some of these out of friends and neighbors' trash after they've planted theirs. And these last almost forever if care is taken. I have a huge stack of these in the garden shed, and we use them year after year. Do you have to use containers like this? Absolutely not. You can use a solo cup with some holes poked in the bottom. You know, it's basically the same thing. So tip number 2 is selecting the right container for starting your seeds. Select a smaller container for things that have a much shorter seed starter cycle, like leafy greens, and maybe pick something bigger for your bigger plants that are going to be in here for a couple of months. Tip number 3, selecting the right growing medium. I used to use just regular potting soil, and I had some successes with that, but I also had a lot of failures. And a lot of that is attributed to the things that are inside that potting mix. A lot of those have fertilizers already added, lots of things that can grow other than your seedlings. Selecting a mix that's specific for seed starting is pretty important. This mix from Fertilome is very basic. It's made from peat moss, perlite, some limestone, and some dolomite. And those are all inert ingredients. There's no nutrient in those, and it's been sterilized. They can put it through a flash freezing process or through a steaming process that kills off of any of those larvae or fungus spores. So you'll get greater successes out of selecting a good seed starting mix. That brings me into another cost-saving opportunity. You don't have to go and buy this. You can make this seed starter yourself. You can use peat moss, or coconut coir is the main ingredient, and then adding some perlite to help with compaction and moisture retention. But the important part of that is you have to go through that process of trying to make that as sterile as possible. And I've done this in the past, and it's not super hard, but this isn't very expensive. This bag was $10. Whenever you make that mix, you put it in a big container, and then I like to just use boiling water and pour that boiling water over the seeding mix. Before you use a seeding mix or even a potting mix, it's best to pre-moisten it where it's like a wrung out sponge. So adding the boiling water and giving it a good stir gives that sterilization that you're looking for. And it's probably going to be as good as the sterilization process that the companies use. After you add the boiling water, just let it drain for a little while till it's that wrung out sponge consistency, and then you're ready to add your seeds. Making your own seed starter mix is a cost-saving opportunity, but for me, going and buying at your local store is a time-saving strategy for myself. It's a little bit easier to go buy this than it is to go through the process of making it. One day when we have a bigger operation, hopefully, then we'll probably make our own seed starting mix in bulk. Tip number 4 is about watering. And in my opinion, watering is where the most care needs to be taken. I have learned more about watering from failure than any other of these tips that I'm going to share with you today. If you water your seedlings too much, they'll suffer from something called damping off disease. That's where they'll look like they're doing well, and then the stem will just kink over. Too little water, and your plant just won't mature. It's really about finding that happy middle ground where your seedlings aren't drowning and aren't drying out. Tip number 5 is all about airflow. Airflow over your seedlings is pretty important. If your growing medium, your soil, gets too wet, then airflow can help reduce that moisture. I found that a little extra airflow around your seedlings helps prevent any kind of molds or funguses that want to grow on the top of the growing medium also. Most importantly, having a fan growing over your seedlings promotes strong stems. I have a small fan here that I connect to the side of my tent that blows over the seedlings. An oscillating fan works probably the best because you can leave that on longer and it'll blow back and forth, creating a natural kind of turbulence to simulate wind. And that's why you want it. If you have a seed that's indoors the entire time and then you take it outside and put it in the garden, it's never experienced any kind of wind turbulence. So the stems won't be as strong. They won't have built up as strong of a fiber mass in the stem to help it stand strong against the wind. Tip number 6, and this is the one you've been waiting for, is about feeding your seedlings. I made a lot of mistakes when it comes to feeding my seedlings early on in my practice. I assumed that the seedling would get its nutrient from the seed or the soil that the seedling was started in. But in reality, the nutrient from the seed is extinguished when that first mature set of leaves come on. And the soil that we use isn't even soil. It's a growing medium. It's usually peat moss or coconut coir that has no nutrient value to it at all. It's an inert, sterile growing medium. It's just there to support the roots and support the seedling during this period of growth. After that set of mature leaves comes on, that's when we start feeding our seedlings liquid fertilizer. And this is one I picked up at a local store. And what you're looking for is a liquid fertilizer that has some low numbers, and they're all about even. This one's a 4-3-3, so it's a 1 step higher on the nitrogen. But if you can find a 1-1-1, a 3-3-3, or even, if you find a 5-5-5, you can dilute it a little bit more. So this one is 2 teaspoons per gallon of water in seed starting. And that's a solution that I'll add to the bottom-up watering process once a week once the seedlings get underway. Don't make the mistakes I did, and make sure that your seedlings are getting fed correctly. Some signs that you don't want to feed is if your plants are starting to look a little stressed, if they're looking wilty, or you're suffering from an overwatering problem. Whenever your seedlings are stressed, that's not a good time to feed, so maybe hold off on a feeding. But if you're on a good feeding schedule and you're following the rest of the tips, you should have good, strong seedlings. In this episode, I gave you 6 tips that I've learned over the years of having strong, healthy seed starters. If you've made it this far in the episode, please consider subscribing. And if you think these are some tips that you'll use this year, hit that like button. And this is me reminding you to plant a seed on making a better Terra.